Atari 50 is a celebration of all things Atari, from the earliest days to the current renaissance. Interestingly, while Atari is very much the focus, the game, or collection, archive, it's hard to classify, which we'll discuss in a moment, does not just look at Atari. The expanded edition brings in games from Mattel and Stern, and the latest DLC adds another company from the golden age of arcade games inextricably linked with Atari, Namco. The Namco Legendary Pack brings a further expansion in not just the games list, but also the archive materials, interviews, vintage TV and movie theater ads, and more. The question is whether this is a worthy examination of the Atari-Namco relationship, or just a bolted-on Namco Museum. This is Chris from Makopowered, and welcome to a... Is this really a weekend rental? A special feature? You know what? Let's call it a weekend rental new release. Welcome to a weekend rental new release special where we will be diving into the Namco Legendary Pack. A couple of things to get out of the way. First, I received the DLC from Atari directly because of this channel and because I responded when they offered on Twitter. That doesn't mean that I'm going to pull any punches or let that sway my opinions and observations. Second, for those of you who follow Friends and Games' channel, and if you don't, you should, Atari 50 Expanded Edition was my game of the year last year. If you've watched that video, you know I had glowing praise for the base game and its prior DLC. Atari 50 Expanded Edition is more than a games compilation. It is nothing less than a full-blown interactive museum with video interviews, archival material, both publicity and behind the scenes, interactive exhibits, and more. It is very possibly the best thing both Atari and Digital Eclipse have ever put out. So, having said all that, does the Namco Legendary Pack live up to its name? That is an interesting question, because there are some fascinating inclusions and omissions. To start, let's talk about why this exists in the first place. For those of you unfamiliar, the respective histories of Namco and Atari are surprisingly intertwined. This goes from Atari's unknowingly illegal Japanese division being sold to Namco in 1974, giving the latter a foothold in the medium of video games, to Namco buying controlling shares of Atari Games, the arcade division, not Atari Corp., the home console division, in the wake of the 1983 North American video game industry crash, to, well, we'll get to that, because it's one of my points of contention with the Legendary Pack. However, let's get this out of the way right now. In the intro, I asked whether the Namco Legendary Pack was just a bolted-on Namco Museum, and the answer is a definitive no. While Namco is definitely the focus of this pack, it is still through the lens of Atari and its history. This means that, while yes, there are a couple of Namco arcade games that are playable here, they are only here because they were distributed by Atari in North America, and are present because they are important exhibits in this wing of the Atari 50 Digital Museum offered by Digital Eclipse. Instead, most of the games present are the home console and computer ports of Namco arcade games made by and or for Atari. And before you ask, yes, the infamous 2600 port of Pac-Man, one of the figureheads of the aforementioned 1983 industry crash, is faithfully represented here, flickering ghosts, square pellets, and all. In fact, there are 3 different versions of Pac-Man in this compilation: the infamous Todd Fry 2600 port, the port to Atari's 8-bit computers, and the 5200 port, which is essentially the same as the 8-bit computer port, except for some minor tweaks. And Pac-Man isn't the only game to receive this treatment. The 2600, 8-bit computer, and 5200 ports of Galaxian are here. Quick note, the former was made originally by General Computing, the same people who designed Miss Pac-Man, and how is it the best version out of the 3 of them? As well as the 2600, 5200, and 8-bit versions of Dig Dug, which, fun fact, was the first video game to get a trailer that played in North American movie theaters, and the 7800 ports of Xevious and Galaga. While I don't have access to an actual 5200, 7800, or Atari 8-bit computer to compare the quality of the emulation here, I do have the 2600 ports of Pac-Man, Dig Dug, and Galaxian. I kind of went through a whole Atari phase over the summer, and can confirm that the versions here play identically to their 40-plus-year-old counterparts. In fact, the closest the Namco Legendary Pack gets to Namco Museum is the inclusion of the arcade versions of Dig Dug and Xevious, and that's because Atari released them in North America. So once again, Namco, but by way of Atari. This led me to wonder about some of the exclusions in this pack. Now, I can understand the absence of Miss Pac-Man, despite the 2600, 5200, and 7800 all receiving ports. There have long been legal issues surrounding the rights to Miss Pac-Man, and with the current situation between Bandai Namco and AtGames over the rights to the game and the character, it makes sense that there was no Miss Pac-Man representation here. That Pole Position and Pole Position 2 are missing in any form, on the other hand, makes less sense. Both games were Namco designed and released by Atari in North America, and both games got home ports for various Atari systems. Pole Position got ports for the 2600 and 5200, and Pole Position 2 got a port for the 7800. I suspect it might be because both games use real-world locations, but that would mean that they couldn't be included in the Namco Museum series either, and both have made appearances there, multiple times. Either way, my research couldn't turn up a reason for this exclusion. The other major exclusion is a far more complex one. See, the timeline offered in the Namco Legendary Pack ends at 1986 and the release of Xevious for the 7800. After this point, things get complicated because of one gigantic factor in the video game industry at that point: the Nintendo Entertainment System. In the wake of the North American video game crash of 1983, Atari was split up into two separate companies, as we mentioned earlier. Atari Games, the arcade-focused division, and Atari Corp, which was focused on home consoles and home computers. Yet again, the histories of Atari and Namco intertwined because Namco bought Atari Games in 1985. Seeing the success of the NES, Atari's new Namco bosses wanted to set up their own home console game division, and so created Tengen. The problem was that Namco and Nintendo were in the middle of a spat about licensing fees, and so Tengen reverse engineered the lockout chip for the NES so they could make unlicensed games for the system. Okay, great, but what does that have to do with the current discussion? Well, in addition to publishing ports of arcade games such as Sega's Afterburner and Shinobi, alongside Atari-developed arcade games like Gauntlet and Vindicators, Tengen published a number of Namco games for the NES. These include Rolling Thunder, RBI Baseball 1-3, known as the Pro Yaku Family Stadium series in Japan, and Pac-Man. In other words, there is an additional rich vein of combined Namco-Atari history that remains untapped in this collection. The wording in the final entry of the timeline maybe sort of hints at an additional follow-up which may address these absences, but we'll see. Speaking of the timeline, there was something interesting done with it at the beginning that we need to discuss so that people don't get the wrong idea, because I certainly did it first. See, the timeline starts in 1955, back when Namco was a mechanical amusements company. Think those pony rides you find outside grocery and department stores. It follows Namco's early days in the video game industry following their buyout of Atari Japan, with the first playable game on the timeline being their first breakout success in Japan. Breakout, it's the original Breakout. This is followed by their next big success, Super Breakout. Now, there are two reasons I bring this up. First, while games like Pong, Space Race, and Le Mans are mentioned, they are not included as playable games. Second, and you will definitely know this if you've spent any time with the base game, Breakout and Super Breakout are not new games exclusive to this DLC pack. They are recycled from the base game. Now, at first this really rubbed me the wrong way, because it felt disingenuous to offer a DLC pack of all new games, and then open it with recycled content from the base game. However, when I stopped to think about it, I understood the decision, especially considering the framework Atari 50 operates under as a whole. This wasn't just recycling or rehashing. This was linking one wing of the museum that is Atari 50 with another. It's not like they're using the inclusion of Breakout and Super Breakout to provide fewer games in this DLC pack, they're just highlighting the intertwined nature of Namco and Atari's shared history. So, is the Namco Legendary Pack worth it? Let me put it this way. If you're the sort of person who would play Atari 50, then yes it is. Sure, a lot of the game lineup boils down to multiple versions of the same game, but I, for one, am more than okay with that. Each version has enough differences that it is fascinating to see what was considered key to the experience for each platform. This is a notion that has always enthralled me. When adapting games from infinitely superior arcade hardware, what can be sacrificed and what is considered essential to make sure that the game is recognizable as the title it is adapting. Even more than that, as with the rest of Atari 50, this DLC pack is a treasure trove of interviews, contemporary publication reviews, business documents, advertisements, and more, all documenting a facet of both Namco and Atari's histories which has, as far as I've been able to determine, never before been explored in a format such as this. Certainly the Namco Museum series has stuck solely to the arcade versions of these games, and the Atari ports have never seen re-releases outside of perhaps those at-games plug-and-play consoles. Obviously, this means that none of this errata has been made available until now either. Oh, I should also mention that I was provided the codes for both the PS4 and Switch versions of the Legendary Pack in order to compare. In terms of the playable games on offer, they are practically one-to-one. Interestingly, there was one discrepancy I encountered. While I did not experience any issues watching the archival videos on the Switch, I did find a couple of instances of lag or loading on the PS4. To be fair, that could have been because there was a background process causing it, but it was still an interesting distinction to be found. So, if you're someone like me who is endlessly fascinated by the history of video games as a medium, and is already in love with Atari 50 and its approach, then the Namco Legendary Pack is a no-brainer. I just hope that we get some of those exclusions mentioned, perhaps as a patch or update. Either way, this new release makes for a good weekend rental.